Well, it was fun branching off into the wild lands of strategy RPGs, but it's about time we got back to the business at hand. Unlike the second entry in the franchise, Onimusha 3 took a good stretch of time to come out, with us seeing 2 whole years go by before we had a chance to jump back in the series. A wait that I would argue was more than worth it, as this is, in my opinion, the highest height Onimusha would ever reach. Yep, it's gonna be another one of those videos. You know, the ones where I'm absolutely biased from the very start and don't even make an attempt at objectivity. So prepare yourselves for a double team of magnificent proportions, a buddy cop movie crossed with a time travel flick, all laid over a bed of quasi-survival horror gameplay, aka absolute perfection. Minasan, Onimusha Retrospective e yokozo. Onimusha 3 is a great example of Capcom noticing a trend in the market and reacting accordingly, something you think a business as big as them would do more often, but we're not having that conversation right now. The second game, as fun as it was, just wasn't received very well among fans of the first one, which shouldn't be a massive surprise since parts 1 and 2 had almost completely different dev teams working on them. After having a bit of a financial fumble of sorts, the orders came down from the top that the original dev team would be heading the third game's production, a lesson that you just wish Konami could have learned, say around 2008. And as such, despite some serious alterations, I think most people would agree this game felt and played much more closely to the original. And speaking of the original, Capcom didn't want to take any chances this time around with their Western audience, so the decision was made to include a new, more Western primary location as to not alienate the non-Japanese portion of the fan base. And while I do kind of think that's a boneheaded reason to go about such a move, I still think it was an awesome direction to take things in. Having this story span an international stage sort of upped the stakes appropriately for what was planned to be the title that bookended the series. As sad as it is, I think a good ending is what really gives a story worth, so while I wasn't happy that one of my favorite game franchises would be no more soon, I did see why it had to be that way. Hell, I'd argue it's better going out strong with a whopper of an ending than it is to slowly make less and less money as the franchise goes on, until the bean counters in charge just can't justify okaying a real closeout for the series. Yes, Konami, I am once again looking in your direction. But we absolutely can't talk about the ending of a story before we jump into its beginning. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is how you nail a transition.
Use it well! This magic power that I have granted you!
Attends! Je n'ai pas encore fini.
Onimusha 3 might as well be a blockbuster movie from the early 2000s, and for anyone not convinced on the spot, might I turn your attention to the ancient Japanese demons attacking modern-day Paris. But we're gonna have to rewind things just a bit. Oni 3 starts proper with Samanosuke taking part in a raid on Honnoji Temple with the intent of finally putting an end to Nobunaga Oda's deadly Genma-backed reign. After fighting his way through the hordes and into the temple itself, Samanosuke deals with Nobunaga's underling, Mori. Okay, before I continue with this, I want you guys to know that I know how much of an ass I sound like pronouncing foreign words properly in an English language YouTube video. For example, this guy's name is Mori Ranmaru, and that's how you're technically supposed to say that, but I can't help but feel like a pompous ass when I do. So just know going forward that we're both aware of what's going on here. Moving on, our guy deals with him in just the most disrespectful manner imaginable. But just before Oda and Samanosuke were able to cross swords, Samanosuke gets a Terminator-style trip to the future. At the same time, in modern-day Paris, the Genma have somehow shown up and began doing a surprisingly good job at taking over a place that supposedly has access to firearms and tanks. Samanosuke suddenly appears in the middle of the melee and helps Jacques, a member of the French military who seems to be one of the only people in the city with working knowledge on how to shoot at something. During the chaos, the two essentially change places, with Jacques heading to ancient Japan and Samanosuke staying in modern-day Paris. After a little progression, we find out that our own personal Mad Genma scientist, Guildenstern, has somewhat perfected time travel tech, and aims to send his Genma army to the future, where there's supposedly no threat of the Oni interfering. Now, with each main character trapped in the other's time, they have to fight the same enemy, but hundreds of years apart, as they each play a role in keeping the Genma from controlling anything in any time period. You've probably noticed Takeshi Kaneshiro makes a return as Samanosuke, and this time they got the legendary Jean Reno to serve as Jacques. He even voiced the character's French lines of dialogue, which isn't exactly the best VA work you could imagine, but still, it just feels right having that voice come out of that face.
Henri, tu dors encore. Lève-toi vite, sinon tu vas être en retard à l'école.
On that note, though, Capcom wasn't able to get him to do the English voice work, so Paul Mercer stepped in, a voice actor you'll likely recognize from his work in the Resident Evil series. Sure, it's a little jarring hearing one voice for the character and then another minutes later, but since it's an Oni fairy's magic that's allowing these two people to even communicate in the first place, I think a little suspension of disbelief isn't too much of a tall order here. After getting the power of the Oni, Samanosuke and Jacques, who I just know I'm going to mistakenly refer to as Jean Reno at least once during this video, use a time-traveling Oni sprite named Akko to communicate and figure out how to proceed. In the future, Samanosuke comes across Jacques' girlfriend and son, which, if I'm being honest, make up some of the worst elements of this story. Honestly, everything else is classic big-budget blockbuster schlock, which is to say perfect, but the parts of the story focusing on Jacques' son Henri and his reluctance to see Michelle as a new mother figure, well, they're exactly as boring as that sounds.
Michelle! Henri! What a wonderful reunion!
The good news is this makes up such a small portion of the story, I doubt it'll bother anyone by the end. The sheer buddy cop movie format this story and its character interactions take is absolutely my cup of tea, and the fish out of water narrative going on with the two is American movie making 101. I get the feeling Oni 3's creators were very much going after the US demographic here, and while you could certainly argue most of us signed up specifically for the ancient Japanese setting and inherent foreign nature of the small details found in Part 1, I definitely won't be deducting any points for going in a different but just as entertaining direction. As is Onimusha tradition by this point, actual historical figures end up starring in supporting roles here, and if you're into that kind of stuff, that could be another plus for you. Personally, that doesn't do a lot for me, but hey, to each his own. Oh, and before we go any further, I gotta throw a little spoiler warning up here, so you know the deal. Skip to the time code on screen or click the notation in the YouTube progress bar to avoid ruining some late game stuff.
You'll be okay, Michelle. Hold on to your seats.
As the title that would put the entire Onimusha main story to rest, I feel like it does a great job of not only wrapping everything up in a nice little bow, but also leaving just a bit to the imagination should there be a need for more entries later down the line. Like you might expect, Nobunaga Oda is finally defeated in the end, giving Samanosuke a little bit of closure, but it seems his job isn't quite finished as he still wields Oda's soul within the gauntlet and apparently needs to seal both away to prevent him from ever returning again. Although that may not be a worthwhile endeavor, seeing as one of Oda's vassals has essentially taken his place as both a conqueror and as a platform for the Genma's earthly reign. On the opposite end of the coin, Jacques' gauntlet is able to use up all of its power to revive a dead Henri who fell victim to Ranmaru's last-ditch effort to get his dignity back, which is such an action movie ending I can't help but cringe over and love it equally. Both parties get what they wanted out of the situation, and each gets to rest knowing that they saved not only the world, but the entire timeline. If you ask me, that's a pretty damn good way to not only wrap up the series in a satisfying manner, but also ensure if more ever needs to be made, there's a healthy narrative and game world to transplant it into. I feel like this is exactly how a series like this should operate. Instead of allowing something good to burn out to the point that even the core audience could care less, you have individual story arcs that have defined endings taking place in a shared universe. Sure, maybe it's the end of Samanosuke's story, but who says someone else couldn't take up the power of the Oni and beat the Genma back? Maybe a little more of this kind of an approach in RE, and it might not have been in the dire straits it would eventually see. But I feel like the older Capcom gets, the less likely it is to learn from both its failures and successes.
Fire!
For those of you that skipped ahead to avoid spoilers, Onimusha 3 provides not only what I think is a fitting end to the series, but also just enough of a thread that could easily be started back up again with a new cast of characters. It's the quintessential end to a series that could easily continue past this point. Capcom's proverbial Silent Hill 3, and if you're even a little interested in these games, it's a you have to see it for yourself type of scenario. This story feels exactly like a cheesy American action movie, and for something like Onimusha, I think that's fitting. After all, we were never really working with what anyone could call a deep narrative, and sometimes it's just okay to indulge that part of your brain that likes to enjoy something dumb every once in a while. The characters are extremely likable, except for Henri, and the antagonists make you hate him exactly enough to keep things moving. Having the game take place over several international landmarks makes for some great stakes raising, and overall, it's just a blast of a time. If you're the kind of person that wonders how a demon scientist from the 1580s created a working time machine, well, this might not be the story for you. But if you just happen to be the type to enjoy a tale about an attractive long-haired Japanese guy absolutely ruining groups of skeletons with weapons seemingly taken out of a Dynasty Warriors game, well, who am I fooling? You probably already played and beaten this game. For anyone in between, though, I thoroughly recommend this one, not only for its story, but for the closure it provides to the series as a whole. Like I've said in the past, a story's ending is almost always much more satisfying than it just continuing on forever, and that's exactly what this is. A nice little finish to what I would call a very imaginative and just flat-out cool premise. So do what you can to unwrap this little ancient Japanese present for yourself. Just stay away from Guildenstern. I'm pretty sure that guy's a diddler.
How I love children. Their organs are so fresh and soft.
Stop!
Onimusha 3 does a lot to shake up what you might be used to with the series, but there's a slight chance some of you watching right now have never played one of these games, so I figure it'd be a good idea to sort of lay things out before going on and on about how much things have changed. So imagine Resident Evil, but demons instead of zombies and swords instead of guns. Boom, you got yourself a pretty damn accurate representation of what you'll see here. The game plays like a classic RE title with puzzle solving, critical thinking, and exploration taking up most of the gameplay pie chart. But of course you aren't going to be finishing any of these games on a pacifist run, so what can you expect from the combat? Well, attacks can be thrown out with a simple press of the square button, but like RE, you can also use R1 to lock onto a single enemy. When using R1, your movement options become a little more tuned towards fast dodging and circling, which solves the age-old question of how the hell are you going to implement a fast-paced, reaction-driven melee combat engine into a game that uses tank controls for movement. Since you're a badass demon hunter for the Oni clan, you can wield cool-ass weapons that can be found as you explore. Each one's going to have a different application, like fast crowd control versus slow but powerful single attacks. Each of those weapons will have their own magic attacks which mirror what I just said, and these pointy objects can also be leveled up with souls that are absorbed from defeating enemies, actively supporting level grinding in an action game, which is something I always thought made Devil May Cry so damn interesting. When not putting swords through Genma, you can expect to be exploring your environment, finding items to open new routes, and solving puzzles in service of that same goal. In that sense, this game will offer a lot of what you may have enjoyed about the first game, but don't go thinking you know exactly what to expect here. Onimusha 3 is deceptively complex in my opinion. On one hand, it feels and plays like the biggest Hollywood action blockbuster you've ever seen in a movie theater, but on the other, it's this perfect merging of the two previous releases in the series. It's not quite the survival horror adjacent experience the first game was, with Samanosuke slowly unlocking more rooms in a large building via puzzle solving or story progression, but it's also not quite part 2 with its emphasis on breaking up that experience between several small explorable areas. One of my chief complaints with Onimusha 2 was that it felt like the game was just teleporting me to different locations as I passed certain story events, so it never really felt like I was organically exploring a world, but instead it sort of fit in more with the traditional video game level-based design. Here in Onimusha, the progression feels much more natural. New areas are probably just as numerous as the second game, but instead of completing a small section and then being transported to some other unrelated area, Oni 3 has you constantly progressing towards the next location in a way that feels like you made it there through your own effort, and not just the game transporting you there once an item was found. I found this to be much more fun and satisfying since it gave me the illusion that I was actually in control of where my characters were going, which is always a tough balancing act for developers to pull off. In previous Onimusha games, there would be sections that had you controlling side characters to shake things up a bit, but here in 3 that was turned into a core component of the gameplay. You spend an even amount of time jumping between the two main characters, and I am very happy to say the developers did a great job of making Jacques and Samanosuke feel mechanically separate from each other, but similar enough that you're not going to have to relearn how to play the game every time you switch. Samanosuke brings that traditional Onimusha experience you've had with both him and Jubei, and Jacques gives you a little more variety with his use of a whip as a main weapon. Now, mostly this may seem like a cosmetic change, but it does shake up the way you engage with combat in his sections. Instead of his charge attack just being a stronger version of a regular single attack, he grabs enemies with his whip, and from there you can either blast them straight in their face piece or throw them at other enemies, giving you a little breathing room when you start getting surrounded. Something that seems like a sort of small addition, but it will have you approaching each main character a little differently, and that's something I definitely appreciate. Because of the grappling you can do with Jacques' whip, I found him to be a powerhouse for dealing with larger, more damage-dealing enemies, while Samanosuke felt a little more tuned for crowd control. The act of switching between characters felt natural for the series since we have been doing it on a smaller scale for every entry so far, and I'd say the dual main character mechanic was a great shot at shaking things up and making the sequel feel like it added to the formula instead of just repeating it. Those of you who have hounded me for my opinion that Capcom should have just kept reproducing Resident Evil 2 over and over again might be a little surprised by this, but I do think it's great to see gradual change in a franchise. I really do like seeing small incremental additions in a series, and I think Onimusha perfectly encapsulates how you would approach that method. Each new game has added small changes or tweaks so that by the time you get to 3, all the new stuff has had enough time to feel like it was always there. In fact, some of you may be surprised when going back to the PS2 original that charge attacks are nowhere to be found. That's exactly what I like to see in a long-running series, and it's awesome to see Capcom not totally retooling the experience from the ground up when sales don't break a certain threshold, although sadly that wouldn't remain the case past this entry. Since Onimusha has always been a more action-focused franchise, there have always been a lot of methods to dispatch enemies and keep from taking damage, and while other games in the series do a great job of not keeping any of that a secret, Onimusha 3's training menu is a godsend. I mean, sure, it's nice finding an in-game document telling you how to perform an ESEN counter, but getting into a mock fight from a menu and trying it out for yourself without the risk of death is such a smart move. I'm surprised this is the first time we're seeing it, especially from a company who used to make a lot of money off of fighting games. Another thing I was very happy to see was this game's runtime. The average player is going to see the end at around the 12 to 13 hour mark depending on how anal they are about getting their gear leveled up, and call me crazy, but adding an average of 3 hours to the runtime between releases in a franchise, well, that's a practice I'd like to see repeated in the AAA gaming space a little more often. And believe me when I say, during those 12 hours you will essentially be playing a big budget action movie. There's this globe-trotting feel that comes from jumping back and forth between landmark locations in both Japan and France, plus the inclusion of the Genma taking over both the past and present raises those stakes to a satisfying degree. Going back to the stuff you'd expect from the series, the puzzle boxes I love so much are back and once again have changed the fundamental way they operate. These things have always just clicked with me and I really can't say why, but the fact that they're optional really helps. Not only do I really enjoy spending an embarrassing amount of time trying to solve these things, but the fear of missing out on that last power jewel was a pretty good motivator too. And continuing on with the stuff that I really like, it was already an interesting move to break the game up into 2 halves with 2 playable characters, but the dev team really capitalized on this by having the 2 paths intersect a few times. At certain points, you'll be locked into the same area with each character, only separated by a few hundred years, so making some kind of change in the past to Jacques will affect Samanosuke in the future, which is a mechanic that made the environmental puzzle solving and exploration all the more sweeter. On top of that, your little Oni fairy Akko can travel between the 2 time periods, bringing items with her, which sets up some really interesting puzzles that work their way into the gameplay in a pretty natural way. Not wanting to break with Onimusha tradition, there is a secondary character to play as here, and I think this might be the most radical departure from what you're used to yet. Michelle here is a gun-toting badass, and the change from a mostly melee-based cast of characters to a totally long-range one was a really cool way to make sure things didn't get boring over the course of the playthrough. And to be honest, this was as far as these guys needed to go. We have a cool as hell take-no-shit female character, armed to the teeth, fighting Genma in modern-day France. Really all I could want in a video game protagonist, but Capcom went the extra mile and gave her several weapons to choose from. She starts off with what seems to be a FAMAS, which believe me is fun as hell to use in a game like this, but she can also come across a badass shotgun and even a grenade launcher. It seems like Capcom put their all behind this one, really wanting it to be a big budget powerhouse, and that's exactly what it feels like. Every possible gameplay dial has been cranked past 11, and yeah, you could sort of argue that it cheapens the smaller, more low-tech approach to the series so far. I think the best way to explain it is like when a lower budget movie is released and gets a big box office follow-up. Sure, there's more funds thrown behind the project this time, and in a perfect world that would translate into a 1-to-1 increase in quality, but maybe a little bit of heart gets lost in the process. You maybe could make an argument like that for Onimusha 3, but I think this might be the rare case where the spirit of the original is able to survive a larger development team with a lot more resources behind it. Typically, when you dump more money into a project, that means more oversight and less chance for experimentation, and maybe that was a slight factor in 3's development, but overall I'd say this game feels like a natural endpoint for what we've seen so far in the series. Clearly, the franchise couldn't have continued like this, since realistically it's not the kind of genre that reliably rakes in the cash with a huge international audience. But you do have to count your lucky stars that we were able to see such a niche concept jump into the realm of mainstream big budgets while still retaining the heart and soul of what made the original so great. As sad as it is to admit, that almost never happens, so when it does, it's a pretty big deal. And after that much positivity, I think it's only right that we shit on it a little too. You know, in the spirit of fairness. Onimusha 3 may be incredibly fun and faithful to its origins, but I really wish the Dark Realm would have been accessible much earlier and throughout the entire game like it was in Part 1. Here in Oni 3, it sort of feels like a last-minute addition for completionists instead of a cool challenge that shows up early on and serves as a nice inspiration for players to keep getting stronger. That being said, including optional routes to travel felt like a really cool addition and a perfect evolution for what this was in the first place. In that same vein, I loved being able to unlock the first game's arsenal, but having it only be accessible after you start a new game plus sort of sucked. These throwbacks are definitely powerful, but not so much that they'll replace the stuff you come across during normal play. If anything, they'll just give you a little variety for the first quarter of the game until you get your gear up to level 2, and then they're sort of useless. On a more hatefully specific note, fuck these giant gorilla Genma. These guys have this belly flop thing they do, and even if you're holding the guard button, the hit stun that comes from the attack can line up just perfectly to lock you into a string of being hit by the same move over and over again. Without Jacques' hold attack, they can be a massive pain in the ass, so I'd recommend spending all of your MP on hammering them with magic spells, especially when you encounter them in a group. I have no idea what it is about Capcom games and primate enemies being annoying as hell to fight, but this shit needs to stop. Continuing with the negativity, the Ys encounters have returned, and much like Onimusha 2, I just can't help but feel like they're a little harder to pull off than the first game. Back in Part 1, I found I could counter most regular enemies with at least some semblance of reliability, but in 3, I could only pull off a few when I was actually trying to. It seems like they move the active frames when an Isen is possible even further towards the moment an attack is about to land, so you'll need to really be sharp because you'll have to hit the attack button right as the attack lands and not just a bit beforehand. Maybe it's just me, but I found this to be way harder to initiate on reaction in a normal fight outside of these rolling guys who are once again the best way to grind souls, or at least the second best way. Later into the game, you come to this section where Past Somonosuke summons an Oni army to fight the Genma Horde, which is awesome by the way, and even just button mashing here, you're almost guaranteed to land several Isens every minute or so. So if you're smart, you will definitely take this opportunity to grind and level the rest of your gear to max. And finally, my last complaint is sort of a half-hearted one. While I do love how varied the gameplay is here, with all sorts of new additions and fun ways to interact with the environment, I still wish we could have had another Resident Evil-like experience. You know, one that has us staying in one or two more confined locations and progressing forward based solely on exploration. I know, I'm turning into that old guy who can't stop yelling at all the Fortnite players that games were just so much better back in my day, but it seems like I have some kind of genetic predisposition to that classic survival horror style of gameplay. And really, no matter what game I'm going to be covering here on the channel, you can expect there will always be an underlying complaint of, man, I wish this played more like Resident Evil. With all that in mind, I can say without even a shred of doubt that Onimusha 3 is the best experience to be had in the series. While I may bounce back and forth between this and the first as my favorite to play, there's no doubt that Onimusha 3 is jam-packed with awesome content. And the most amazing part is, they crammed all this new stuff in without altering that core Onimusha soul that we've come to expect. Sure, there's a lot more options available this time around, but they all still exist within a framework that's recognizably Onimusha. It's not very often you see a series spend this much time innovating and still deliver something that feels true to the games that came before it, and in that sense, it deserves even more praise than it already gets. Sure, it's fun as all hell, but it also represents a very important approach to game design that you just don't see too much anymore. Somehow, this smaller Capcom side project handled the growing pains that comes with popularity and financial success better than the series that spawned it. This is a flat-out must-play. Even if you didn't find yourself enjoying Part 1, I'd say there's enough altered here that you still stand a good chance at having a great time. Hell, if anything, 3 might pave the way for more people enjoying the first game. And anything that acts as a gateway drug into more survival horror experiences is always going to be a good thing for me. I'll say it one more time for the people in the back. You need to play this game. It is the most robust experience you'll have with an Onimusha title, bar none, and one hell of a fun time regardless. Plus, and let's be honest here, most importantly, it is quite literally the only game where you can play as Jean Reno, and I feel like that's all that needs to be said on the matter. By now, I assume you guys know me. I'm a simple man. If it has 3D characters running around on a 2D pre-rendered background, I'm pretty damn happy, which is why I fell in love with Onimusha in the first place. I mean, yes, it's an amazing game in its own right, but man is a visual creature, and it was the Resident Evil-esque presentation that really caught my eye in the first place. I say all this up front because Oni 3 decided it was too good for that antiquated type of style, and instead we have fully 3D environments. And yeah, maybe I would have preferred that older look, but I think anyone with eyes in their head can see this is an incredibly impressive game as far as visuals are concerned. And while doing my research, I found that the switch from 2D to 3D backgrounds was less of a creative choice and more of a cost-cutting measure. See, parts 1 and 2 actually received a lot of their initial design on PS1 hardware, and I guess they had made so much progress in those builds that a complete retooling would have cost too much time and money. 3 seems to be the first game in the series built from the ground up for PS2 hardware, so they were able to really go wild and take advantage of the increased horsepower at their disposal. Something that isn't so much important to mention, but more of a really cool tidbit. Getting back to the actual subject at hand, the world you run around in here is absolutely jaw-dropping, with an incredible initial design furthered by the game throwing around a staggering number of polygons. I think one of the things going in its favor was a team of artists who were able to get a good hold of solid camera placement and pleasing architecture from their work on the pre-rendered entries in the series. On top of that, a lot of these locations were either taken from the real world or inspired by it, so even when the story and scenarios are at their wackiest, you can still suspend your disbelief since you're most of the time occupying a real space that actually exists outside the game. Those of you familiar with the PS2 era will have probably noticed that this game has a much more aliased, almost pixelated look to it when compared to other games on the console, which I think is a result of more complex geometry being used. What I mean by that is most games probably use a lot more simple shapes and curved lines to achieve a more rounded, less alias look. This results in less polygons being needed to cover less complex designs. Onimusha also makes use of a lot of shaded colors, which I think can add to the complexity of the resulting picture. For example, an equally impressive title on the platform, Dirge of Cerberus, uses more flat shades and rounded geometry, leading to what I would call a simpler but softer picture, where Oni 3 can seem much more pixelated by comparison. Now, it's certainly a matter of preference, but I would imagine most people would accept a little aliasing if it means having this much amazing stuff going on screen. Of course, a lot of that aliasing would be a lot easier on the eyes if I were able to force progressive scan on this game, but I decided to use a real disc this time around since my experience with Onimusha 2 and the ISO loading PS2 program OPL resulted in some slowdown and odd behavior. So sadly, we are stuck with an interlaced 480i picture, which was how a vast majority of PS2 games were designed to be seen anyways. Thanks to this interlacing, the aliasing can seem to shimmer when the screen is in a lot of motion, but the good news is neither the aliasing nor the interlaced video will be much of a problem on a CRT display. The softer, less defined nature of CRTs will definitely mask a lot of visual flaws that come from how I capture my footage specifically. Speaking of which, what we're looking at is real PS2 video output hitting the amazing RetroTink 5X via a YPBPR or component connection. The Tink 5X is hands down the best line multiplier money can buy at the moment, and it specifically makes PS2 games look incredible thanks to its use of an adaptive method of deinterlacing, meaning it combines the two 480i fields into a single frame of video. This can result in a bit of softness on objects and a lot of motion compared to the extreme sharpness of more stationary stuff, but unless you're sitting very close to a large display, I doubt that would be something that would even jump out at you in normal play. I'm using the Tink's 1440p output to get the footage you're seeing, and I can honestly say this is breathtaking to see in real life. If you're looking for that one thing that'll kick you in the ass and force you to finally pull the trigger on retro video scaling, I'd say if the image on screen isn't it, well, nothing is. Now, of course, we couldn't discuss Onimusha 3's crisp look without at least mentioning the absolutely jaw-dropping CG cutscene that serves as an intro. Wanting this to be a marvel of its time, Capcom hired director Takashi Yamazaki and Kung Fu superstar Donnie Yen to put together a real work of art, and the result is just that. From what I understand, this cutscene alone had more than 100 people working on it and took 2 damn years to finish, so when you boot up a game of Oni 3, you're almost contractually obligated to watch it out of respect alone. Just like every entry in the main series, Onimusha 3 uses real people as a basis for its main characters, with Takeshi Kaneshiro returning as Samanosuke and Jean Renault serving as Jacques. If you ask me, the real-life facial modeling is at its peak here in Oni 3, but to be fair, it has looked good in every title so far. If you remember my coverage of the first game, I was blown away at the fact that it was masquerading as a more horror-based title and yet had the stones to be incredibly colorful. Something you don't really see often in this genre, and Oni 3 definitely keeps that same aesthetic. Almost every screen in the game is popping with seriously bright colors, the sections taking place in Japan especially. Some areas make use of either bloom lighting or something closely approximating it, and this goes a long way in making the picture look much more impressive visually than a lot of its contemporaries. So it should be clear that, at least in my opinion, Onimusha 3 is one of the most impressive graphical experiences you'll find here on the PS2. Rubbing elbows with timeless visual presentations like those found in Silent Hill 3 and Valkyrie Profile 2. But if you know me, you know there's something else I'm dying to talk about. After having 0 ports to look at with Onimusha 2, it's awesome to declare that we actually have an alternate release to compare against the PS2 original this time around. Or 2, technically speaking.
And you are Hidemitsu Samanosuke Akechi, aren't you? Then it's a duel!
The Windows version of Onimusha 3 was released about 2 years after the original here in the States and used to be kind of easy to get a hold of. At the time, physical game discs were much more the norm, but a digital version was made available about a year after its initial release with a Steam port. The only problem being that Steam version's only playable for people who bought it back then. It has since been delisted, and that's a real shame because it forced me to go online and find less than legal ways to grab footage of it running. In my search for a 2007 PC game no one really played, I found an ISO, installed it, and got ready to go. But I found out I had downloaded what looked like a modified version of the Japanese release, sporting a title screen that should be familiar to anyone interested in obscure Resident Evil PC ports. Yeah, it turns out the Sourcenext PC ports didn't end with RE3, which was a real surprise. Now, I will admit I didn't see much in this version that A, wasn't visually similar to the regular US release, and B, significantly better looking than what was on offer on the PS2, at least within reason. Of course, this version is going to operate at a higher vertical resolution, but other than that, there wasn't much else I saw here that set it apart. For those of you not in the know, the Sourcenext ports of RE2 and 3 were world-renowned for having nearly uncompressed 60 frame per second CG cutscenes, and if you've never seen them before, I'd heavily suggest checking out my videos covering them because it is truly a sight to behold. Sadly, I didn't notice that kind of a graphical jump here, but as you would expect, the video files in the PC version are far less compressed than what's on offer in the PS2 release, so you will be treated to some killer-looking stuff regardless. Which is something I wish I could say for the rest of the port. Sadly, this PC version is locked at a very low frame rate, or at least it was for me. Since this is a lesser-known release of the game, a Google search didn't turn up too many people discussing it, but no matter what settings I used, I could not get a smooth frame rate out of this thing. So I went looking for another ISO, which ended up being the actual US release put out by Ubisoft of all companies, and was able to get a much smoother experience there. I used the Onimusha 3 Enhanced mod available at its PC Gaming Wiki entry to force compatibility with modern controllers, and I'm not sure, but this may have also fixed the frame rate issues. Using the launcher, you can set widescreen resolutions, but don't get too excited because it's not actually widescreen. It's just the original 4:3 image being stretched to a vertical resolution of 1080 pixels. And the resulting picture is oddly both better and worse than what you'll get on PS2. On one end, you have a much sharper, less aliased look, but on the other, for some reason, the PC release is missing all kinds of effects found in the original PS2. It seems like shadows are just non-existent here, and I really couldn't say why. So you're left with a very washed out looking image, but on the plus side, the lighting has been cranked up to 11. This scene here in Paris has the police lights reflecting off the environment in a way that looks amazing. Now, if only there was some semblance of shadows or even darkness to complete the look. Oh, and for some reason the brightness has been blown out here, so don't expect to see any details in any bright colors. I was able to map controls to an Xbox One controller no problem, but just could not find a way to map the Oni form to it, so if you're planning on trying this version out, which I don't recommend, don't worry about absorbing purple souls because you won't be able to use them. And honestly, I wish there were more to say here, but the Sourcenext and Ubisoft PC ports are both inferior to the original release in nearly every way, minus raw resolution, and trust me, it is not worth jumping through all these hoops just to get a higher res image. But you know damn well that wasn't going to stop me from comparing the two. As you can see, the PC port does away with a lot of the aliasing you'll see in the PS2 release, but the added contrast and shading and non-blown out levels makes the PS2 original superior in almost every way. If you are looking to start up a game of Onimusha 3 and are looking to get a little more resolution out of it than the PS2 version offers, I would say you'd be better off just emulating, because this PC port is an absolute mess no matter how you slice it. And with that, we have come to the end of what is my absolute favorite entry in this incredibly interesting series. Thanks to relatively disappointing sales of Part 2 in the West, Capcom pulled out all the stops with 3, making it feel like what it is. A massive budget title looking to ape a little bit of that American blockbuster movie magic. And you might figure that for a franchise that started as a more slow-building, atmospheric type of deal, that I'd be mad about that, and in any other circumstance you'd be spot on, but you really just can't beat how much is on offer here in terms of sheer fun. Onimusha 3 does so much to keep the experience feeling fresh over its impressive runtime, and in my opinion, nearly all of it was a massive success. But sadly, that didn't exactly translate into financial success. While Oni 3 did numbers in Japan, Western sales were less impressive, or at least less than what Capcom wanted, and I think that's why this would be the very last numbered entry in the series. Much like nearly everything I get into, me and the rest of the world just can't seem to see eye to eye, and that means good series very rarely last for me. But on the plus side, we did get an amazing trilogy of games that expertly combined action-based melee combat with survival horror gameplay in a way that no one, including myself, thought was possible. And we do have 2 spin-off titles left to cover, so we're not exactly finished here. I sincerely hope that I was able in this video to convey just how much I love this game, but just in case I didn't, please go out and try it for yourself. I promise you it will leave a lasting impression. But do keep in mind it will be followed by the depressing realization that you may never play anything like it again. Sadly, it seems like the modern gaming market just isn't interested in experimenting with game ideas that aren't already guaranteed to make money hand over fist, so if we ever did get another Onimusha game, instead of fast-paced, nearly survival horror action, we'd be more likely to get crafting and battle royale mechanics. But hey, I guess that's why most of you come to this channel anyways. Things just aren't as cool as they used to be, and it's nice to take 40 minutes or so out of your day and have someone remind you how good we had it back then. And in that spirit, or maybe diametrically opposed to it, I hope to see all of you again when we finally cover the ungodly combination of Onimusha and Smash Brothers, a title I've actually never played for myself. But until then, minasan, arigatou gozaimashita. Welcome to the end of this experiment in filleting an early 2000s PS2 game, everyone. Thanks for sticking around this long, and if you found something in this video you appreciated, maybe think about checking out my Patreon page where you can fund more projects just like this. Or check out my merch store, which has what is, in my opinion, some of the coolest designs ever printed to fabric. If that's not your speed, maybe a quick like or subscribe? Or hell, just make a checkout for $100,000 and mail it to me. I think we can both agree I've earned it. Alright guys, see all of you later, stay safe, and send that damn check.